The last morning I put the bowl on the stump, I stood there longer than usual. Cass sat at my knee, her ears up toward the tree line the way they always went up there, and I had my hand resting on the top of that old cedar post, feeling the grain of it under my palm, the wood gone silver and soft from 40 years of weather. The bowl was plain white enamel, chipped at the rim. Cornmeal mush, same as always, cooled to the temperature of the air. I had made it the way my mother made it, measured by eye, a little salt, nothing else. I stood there looking up at the dark edge of the timber, the second-growth fir and tamarack beginning exactly where the cleared ground ended, and I thought, I'm 71 years old, and I have never told this to another living person. My mother is gone. My brother Dale is gone. The only one left who knew any part of it is me. And if I take it with me, it disappears entirely like it never happened at all. I don't want to do that to the truth. So let me start from the beginning. Let me tell it the way it actually was, without dressing it up or talking it down, and let you make of it whatever you're able to make of it. My name is Roy Harmon. I am 71 years old. I spent 33 years falling timber in the Selkirk foothills of northern Idaho, from the time I was 18 until I was 51, and my back finally told me it was done. I have worked second-growth Douglas fir and old-growth western red cedar. I have worked in snow up to my waist, and in August heat that came off the slash, like something from an oven. I know that country the way you know the inside of your own house. I know where the ground drops off into the draws that drain into the South Fork of the Priest River. I know the difference between the sound a tree makes when it wants to go the direction you planned and the sound it makes when it has decided otherwise. I know how to read the color of sky at 4:30 in the morning over the Cabinet Mountains to the east and tell you whether the afternoon is going to hold or turn. I am not a man who mistakes things. I am not a man who has ever seen the point in exaggerating. In 33 years of falling timber, not one man in my crews ever accused me of that. I want to be clear about what kind of person is telling you this, because what I'm about to tell you is the kind of thing a person like me would normally dismiss, without a second thought. My father died in 1959. I was 6 years old. He had been working a skidder contract on the private timber above our place when a choker cable parted and came back at him. He was gone before the crew got to him. My mother Edna was 32 years old, left with me and my brother Dale, who was 10 and 40 acres of homestead ground on the western slope of the Selkirks, about 11 miles east of the town of Priest River. The property ran up from the valley road along a creek bottom, through maybe 20 acres of cleared pasture and garden, and then up into unbroken timber that went on for miles without a cabin or a road. She had the house, a small barn, a root cellar, and a cast-iron cook stove that took 2 men to move, and she had the 2 of us. That was what she had. She was not a complaining woman. She was not a dramatic woman. She was small and dark-haired, and she worked from first light until after dark, without making a particular point of it. She kept a kitchen garden that produced enough to put up through the winter, kept a milk cow and 6 laying hens, and took in mending and seamstress work from the families in the valley below. She was precise about things. She measured ingredients by weight on a postal scale she kept on the kitchen shelf. She kept a notebook recording the first frost date each autumn and the last frost date each spring, going back to the year she and my father moved onto the place. The notebook was in a fireproof tin box under the kitchen counter. I still have it. She was also the kind of woman who, when she had concluded something, did not feel the need to explain her conclusion to anyone. She just acted on it. That quality caused me confusion when I was young. Later, after everything I'm going to tell you, it was the thing I understood about her best. The summer of 1961, I was 8 years old. Dale was 12. It was late July, a dry summer, the kind we get in the northern Rockies when the snowpack is thin and the creeks drop to gravel by mid-month. Dale had gone down to the valley with Edna in the truck to pick up a hardware order, and I had stayed home because I had decided I was old enough to stay home alone. I had argued for this privilege and apparently made a sufficient case, because Edna left me with instructions about the cow and the hens, and drove away without looking back. I fed the cow. I fed the hens. Then I went up the pasture toward the timber the way I had been told not to do when I was alone. I don't say that to make myself sound reckless. I say it because it is what happened, and I have spent enough decades with this account to know that softening the facts at any point makes the whole thing less credible, not more. I was 8. The timber looked interesting. I went. The upper edge of the pasture was marked by a big cedar stump, maybe 4 feet across at the base, all that was left of a tree my father had taken out for fence posts before I was born. The bark had long since fallen away, and the wood had gone that grey colour old cedar goes in the weather. I climbed over the fence at the stump the way I had done before and went into the timber. I don't know precisely what happened next, in the sense that I cannot tell you at what point I understood I was lost. It came on gradually, the way it does with children in timber, where the light changes character and the landmarks you thought you had memorized turn out to be trees that look like other trees. I kept thinking the pasture was just beyond the next rise, and it wasn't, and by the time I understood it, genuinely wasn't. I had been moving uphill for a while. The ground was dry and the duff was deep, and I was not leaving much of a track. Dale told me later that he and Edna got home around 4 in the afternoon, and I was not at the house. He told me what Edna's face did when she realized I was not there, and he only told me once, and I'm not going to repeat it here. He went up the pasture calling my name. He found the place where I had gone over the fence at the cedar stump. The search ran 3 days. 31 volunteers from the valley and the neighbouring properties, plus 2 men from the county sheriff's office, covering the timber above our homestead in a grid that expanded outward from the stump. My brother was in it from the first morning, working the draws to the north where the creek split into 2 fingers of drainage. The sheriff's men had dogs, but the dogs lost the track early in the second day, on a shelf of exposed granite where the wind ran consistently from the northwest. 3 days, 31 people, 2 miles of rough Selkirk timber in July. They found me alive, unharmed, 2 miles upslope from where I had crossed the fence, sitting on a flat rock beside a small spring seep in the early morning of the 4th day. I was not hungry. I was not dehydrated. I had no scratches, no insect bites, no sunburn beyond what I already had from the previous weeks. The sheriff's deputy who found me wrote in his report that the boy appeared to have been sheltered, though he was alone when located and there was no evidence of another person in the vicinity. I know this because my brother obtained a copy of that report 20 years later, when the county converted old case files to microfiche and released certain records to family members on request. He sent me a photocopy in 1983. I still have it. The word sheltered is underlined in the deputy's handwriting, and beside it, in a different ink that looks like it was added later, is a question mark. The official explanation at the time, and the one that circulated through the valley for years, was that I had found natural shelter in the timber, stayed put as children are told to do, and that the searchers had simply not covered that particular drainage on the first 2 passes. That is a plausible explanation. I understand why it was the one that stuck. It accounts for most of the facts. It does not account for all of them. I told my account to the deputy on the morning I was found, and he wrote some of it down and then stopped writing, and looked at me with the expression adults use when they have decided a child is confused or frightened, and that the words coming out of his mouth are not to be taken as a reliable record. I told the same account to Edna that evening, sitting at the kitchen table while Dale stood in the doorway. Dale did not say anything. Edna listened to the whole thing without interrupting, which was unusual for her. When I was done, she sat for a moment with her hands flat on the table. "Did it hurt you?" she said. "No," I said. "Was it afraid of you?" I thought about that. "No," I said. "I don't think so." She nodded once, the way she nodded when she had finished calculating something and arrived at a figure she found satisfactory. She did not ask me anything else about it. Not that evening, not the next day, not in the years that followed. Dale never brought it up directly either, though I caught him watching me once or twice that summer in a way that suggested he was running the arithmetic and not quite getting it to come out even. The Valley's version of events settled into the official one within a week. I was a small boy who had gotten turned around in the timber, stayed put, and been found alive. End of account. I was not going to argue with that version because I was 8 years old and I'd already seen what the deputy's face did when I talked, and I understood, even at 8, what that face meant. The following autumn, after the first frost, my mother began leaving a bowl of cornmeal mush on top of the big cedar stump at the upper pasture fence. Every morning, before she did anything else, before she started the stove fire or fed the cow, she carried the bowl up in the early dark and set it on the stump and came back down. Whatever was in the bowl was always gone by the time the light was fully up. She never said why she did this. She never referred to it. If Dale or I mentioned it, she redirected the conversation with the particular economy of a woman who has decided a subject is settled. I want to be precise about this. I knew at 8 years old why she was doing it. I did not know whether she knew that I knew. It was one of those understandings that two people can carry in the same house for years without ever naming it. And sometimes that is the correct way to carry a thing. She kept that practice for 31 years. Through my boyhood and my logging years and the 6 years of my marriage before my wife Carol passed. Through Dale's move to Spokane and his occasional visits. Through the long winters of her widowhood when it was just Edna on that 40 acres with the stove and the cow and the kitchen garden. Every morning, dark or light, rain or frost or August heat. She died in February of 1992, and when I came back to settle the property, I found the last bowl still on the stump, frozen into the cedar wood. I stood there with my hands in my coat pockets for a long time before I took it inside. I inherited the property. I'm still on it now. I want to tell you, before I get to the account itself, about the years I spent working the timber above that homestead. I need to do this because the account does not stand by itself. It stands on everything that came before and everything I observed in those years. And a person who just hears the events of those 3 days in 1961 without the context of what I know of that country will have no reason to credit it. I started as a choker setter at 18, which is the job where you crawl under logs in the slash and hook the cable around them so the yarder can pull them to the landing. It is not a job that builds any romantic ideas about the timber. I worked my way up through the crews, got my Faller's certification at 23, and spent the next 30 years on the steep ground above the South Fork drainage, working both private and Forest Service contracts from the Idaho Panhandle. I felled timber within a mile of my mother's homestead, probably 100 days in those years, on the contracts that came out of the upper benches and the north-facing slopes where the cedar and white pine had not yet been taken. In that time, I saw things in the timber that I filed away and did not talk about, because talking about them would have cost me something I was not willing to spend. A camp cook on a landing contract in 1971, who had been on the cruise for 20 years, told me once, when we were the only two awake and the camp was quiet, that the country around the Upper Priest River drainage was not country you could account for entirely. I asked him what he meant. He shook his head and said he meant what he said. I did not push it. I understood that a man who had spent 20 years in that timber and still talked that carefully about a thing he had observed was a man whose observation I should take seriously. I took it seriously. In the spring of 1974, I was working a thinning contract on a bench about 1.5 miles above my mother's property line. My partner that season was a faller named Gary Sund, a careful man from Sandpoint, who had been in the trade since before I was. We were working separate corridors about 200 yards apart, the way you do on a thinning job, staying within earshot of each other's saw. One afternoon in April, I came around the backside of a big cedar windfall and stopped. In the duff beside the windfall was a set of tracks in a patch of soft ground where a seep had come up and then dried back. I stood there for a considerable while. I measured the length of the impression against my boot, which was a size 11 logger. I did it 3 times. The impression was roughly twice the length of my boot. The stride between prints where I could read the sequence was something over 5 feet on the uphill side. There was no clawing at the front of the impression, which eliminated bear definitively. The depth was consistent with weight, not with a shallow print in soft ground. I did not call Gary over to look at it. I noted the location relative to a blazed survey stake nearby, a corner marker for a township section. I went back to work. That evening in camp, I wrote down what I had seen in the small field notebook I kept in my shirt pocket, noting the date, the section marker, and the measurements. I have that notebook. It is in the same fireproof tin box as my mother's frost records. The following summer, working a different contract on the drainage to the east, I began to notice something that I noticed with a faller's kind of attention, which is the attention of a man who has trained himself to observe the timber around him, because inaccurate observation in that trade will kill you. There was a stretch of the north-facing slope, maybe 300 yards across, where the understory had been disturbed in a way that did not correspond to game movement or wind damage. Branches broken at a height that deer and elk could not reach. Logs rolled from their original positions, which I could tell by the lighter soil color exposed underneath and the absence of the usual rot pattern at the old contact points. Something had been moving through that slope regularly and moving carefully, and was large enough to move the objects it encountered rather than going around them. I tried the rational accounting on all of it. A bear denning in the area and ranging wide. A second bear. An elk with unusual behavior during rut. I knew what bear sign looked like after 30 years in that timber, and bear sign has particular characteristics I can name precisely, from the claw marks in the bark where they stand up against a tree to the way they move through brush, which is a crashing, indifferent passage that leaves a wide signature. This was not that. The movement I was reading was deliberate. It went around certain obstacles and through others in a pattern that I could not fully explain as any animal I knew. I did not find myself frightened by this. That is the honest account of my internal state, to whatever extent I can accurately report it. I found myself paying attention the way I paid attention to things in the timber that required my full professional regard. The thing I was most careful about in all those years was keeping separate what I could verify from what I was inferring. I was not going to say I knew what was moving on that slope. I was going to say that I had observed evidence consistent with a large bipedal animal moving through the north-facing drainage above the South Fork, and that I had no rational explanation that accounted for all the specific characteristics of what I had observed. That is the most honest version of the statement, and I stand by it. Now I need to tell you about the 3 days in 1961. I have told this account twice in its complete form. Once to Dale in 1983, when he sent me the photocopy of the deputy's report and called me on the telephone to talk about it. Once to you, now. My wife Carol knew there was an account I carried, and she knew its general shape, but I never gave her the full version because I was not yet ready to say it in its full form, and she died before I got there. And I have not forgiven myself for that omission, though I have made some peace with it over time. The first night in the timber, I was frightened. I want to say that plainly. I was 8 years old and the light had gone out of the sky, and I was in old-growth timber where the canopy was dense enough to eliminate the stars, and I could not tell which direction was downhill. I had gotten turned around twice trying to correct my course, and had stopped moving because stopping was the only thing I could do that would not make it worse. I sat down at the base of a large fir, put my back against the root collar, and waited. I heard something moving in the timber above me. Uphill, at a distance I could not measure in the dark. It was not the sound of a deer or an elk. It was not the crashing and snuffling of a bear. It was a deliberate sound, a patient sound, the sound of something that knew exactly where it was going and was not in a hurry about it. I sat very still. The sound moved closer and then stopped, and in the silence that followed, I became aware that whatever had been making it was now standing at a distance I estimated, even in the dark, as perhaps 40 feet from where I sat, because I could hear it breathing. The breathing was deep and slow and low, not a panting or an excited sound, a breathing like the sound of a bellows, worked steadily by someone who was not tired. I did not run. I do not fully know why I did not run. In retrospect, I think the quality of the sound was not threatening in the way a child's nervous system is built to recognize threatening. It was large and close and entirely outside my experience, but it was not coming at me. After a long time, the breathing slowed, and then there was a sound of movement, not away from me, but around me to my left, lower downhill, and then something was set on the ground perhaps 8 feet from where I sat. I could hear it placed, not dropped, a soft placing. Then the movement went back uphill, and the breathing grew more distant, and eventually I could not hear it anymore. I sat there until I was certain it was gone. Then I moved to where the sound of the placing had come from, and put my hand on the ground and found a pile of something. I could not see it. I could feel it, round, hard-shelled, smooth. Berries, I thought. Wild huckleberry, which I knew, by feel from picking them with my mother. A substantial pile, maybe 2 cupped handfuls. I ate them. I am not ashamed of that. I was 8 years old, and I had been in the timber since mid-morning, and I ate every one of them. I slept against that root collar, and woke up to grey morning light, with the dew on my arms and a deer looking at me from 10 yards away. The second day I tried to find my way downhill and could not. The terrain on that slope did not cooperate with my understanding of which way downhill should be, because the ridgeline ran at an angle that confused my sense of direction. I was not panicking, but I was tired and I was thirsty, and the huckleberries from the night before were a long time ago. Sometime in the early afternoon, I came to the small spring seep that I would later be found beside, and I drank from it and sat down. The sound came again in the late afternoon, before the light went, and this time I saw it. I want to be careful about how I say what I saw, because I have gone over it in my memory 1,000 times, and I have weighed every word. I am not going to tell you what I think it was in any categorical sense. I am going to tell you what I observed. It came into a gap in the canopy about 60 feet up from the spring. The afternoon light was coming through the gap at a low angle, throwing long shadows east across the slope. It stood at the edge of the gap, not in the full light, in the transition between shadow and direct sun, and it was still for a long time before it moved. It was large. That is the first and most unambiguous fact. I was an 8-year-old boy, and I had grown up around large men, loggers and ranchers. And this was not on that scale. It was on a different scale entirely. The shoulder height, standing, was above what I could reasonably account for as human, and the width across the shoulders was proportional to that height, in a way that made me think of the big Douglas fir logs I had seen on the landing skids, the old-growth ones that took a full crew to handle. The colour was a dark reddish-brown, the colour of old cedar heartwood, and where the light caught it, there was a depth to it, a texture that I could see even from that distance. It stood for a long time looking at me. I did not look away. I want to be clear that I was frightened in a technical sense. My heart was going at a considerable rate, but the fear was not of the kind that produced any urge to flee. The eyes at that distance, in that light, were dark and steady, and they were looking at me with what I can only describe, from my present-day vantage, as recognition. Not surprise, not aggression. A kind of serious attending, as if it had known I was there for some time, which I believe it had. It moved to the edge of the spring and set something down again. I watched it do this. The movement was not hurried or clumsy. It was the kind of movement a person uses when they are putting something down carefully in front of someone who is uncertain, giving them room, not pressing. It straightened, looked at me once more, and then moved back up the slope into the shadow under the canopy. It moved on 2 feet. It moved with a gait that was not the gait of a man in any ordinary sense. A longer, more grounded stride, the weight carried lower, but it was bipedal, and it was capable, and it was deliberate. It did not crash through the brush. It went through the timber the way a person who has spent their whole life in that timber goes through it, threading the gaps, reading the ground. I went to where it had set things down. There were more huckleberries, a larger amount than the night before, and there was water in a folded piece of birch bark creased and shaped into a rough cup, still holding. I drank the water. I ate the berries. I sat beside the spring and watched the direction the thing had gone until the light was gone entirely. On the morning of the 3rd day, I woke beside the spring to find it had been there again in the night. I knew this not because I had heard it, but because there was a pine bough, a large one, set at an angle against the root of a nearby tamarack in a way that formed a low shelter over the spot where I had been sleeping. The bough had not been there when I lay down. It was fresh broken, the sap still running at the break point where it had been separated from the tree, and it was positioned with a deliberateness that I, even at 8 years old, could not mistake for anything accidental. Something had stood over me in the dark and covered me while I slept. That is the fact I have carried for 63 years. That is the one I have never been able to account for with any other explanation. I did not see it that 3rd day. The search party came up the drainage in the morning, Dale's voice out in front of the others calling my name, in the way only a person who has been calling the same name for 3 days, without answer, calls it. I came down to them through the timber, and the deputy wrapped a blanket around my shoulders and walked me back to the trail. I looked back once toward the spring seep before the timber closed behind me. I felt, and I want to be careful about this word, because it is one I do not use casually. I felt watched, not in a threatening way, in the way you feel watched by someone who wanted to see that you were all right before they let you go. Dale told me, when we talked in 1983, that when he found me I had looked, in his words, like a child who had been camping, not like a child who had been lost. I had not cried when he reached me. I had been sitting on the flat rock eating the last of the huckleberries. He said he hadn't known what to make of that at the time, and he still didn't. And then he said, quietly, that he thought Edna had known what to make of it. that the bowl had been her way of saying thank you to something she had no words for. Dale said that in the matter-of-fact way of a practical man who has decided late in life that there are certain accounts he is going to credit even when they don't balance out on paper. Edna died in February of 1992. She was 64 years old and the winter took her hard, and she went in the way she had lived, without a great deal of unnecessary comment. I was at the house with her at the end. The morning before she lost the thread of things entirely, she took my hand and held it for a while, and then she said, clearly enough that I have never misremembered it, "You keep the bowl on the stump." Not a question. Not a request precisely. A statement of what she expected would happen, the way she used to tell me to check the fence line before the first snow, or to put the hay up before it rained. A practical instruction from a woman who had measured everything carefully her entire life. "All right," I said. "She died the following evening, and I have thought about those 4 words and those 2 words nearly every day since. I kept the bowl on the stump for 9 years after I inherited the property. I made the cornmeal mush the way she had made it. I carried it up in the early morning before anything else. Some mornings Cass came with me and sat at my knee, with her ears turned toward the tree line, calm and attentive in the particular way she was always calm and attentive at that spot. Other mornings, I went alone. The bowl was always empty by the time the full light came. I'm not going to tell you that I saw something in those 9 years, in a way I could document. I'm going to tell you that there were mornings in that timber, working the lower edge of the property on fence repair or cutting firewood in the second growth above the pasture, when I was aware of being in the presence of something patient and very large and not threatening. The same quality I had felt at 8 years old looking up at the gap in the canopy beside the spring. The quality of a serious attending, a watching without any hostile intent behind it. On those mornings, Cass never growled, never raised her hackles. She went about her business with an ease that she did not have on mornings when a bear was working the berry patches on the upper bench, when her whole body changed into attention and readiness. At the stump, she was simply at rest. That is the only way I know to say it. I stopped the bowl 9 years after Edna died. I want to be honest about why, because the honest account matters more to me at this point than a clean story does. I did not stop because I stopped believing. I stopped because I was 60 years old and I was tired in a particular way that comes from carrying a thing alone for a long time. And I felt, without being able to defend this feeling on any rational grounds, that the practice had run its natural course. That what needed to be honored had been honored, and that what remained was for me to find a way to speak the account before I ran out of time to speak it. The morning I stood at the stump with the last bowl, Cass at my knee, the timber dark beyond the fence line, I understood something about my mother that I had been moving toward for decades. She had not kept that practice out of superstition or sentiment. She had kept it the way you keep a promise, the way you honor a debt to someone who asked nothing in return. The thing in the timber had brought her child back to her, fed and sheltered and covered against the cold, and had asked nothing. Had not presented itself at the house, had not sought any acknowledgement, had simply done the thing and gone back to the country it came from. She had answered that in the only language available to her, a bowl on a stump every morning, for 31 years. I set the bowl down on the cedar wood for the last time and stood there with the cold air moving off the timber and Cass pressing against my leg with her warm, solid weight. The tree line was beginning to come up out of the dark as the light built behind the cabinets to the east. I looked at the line where the cleared ground ended and the timber began, the place where the human-built part of the world stopped and the older country started, and I felt the weight of 63 years of carried silence shift in me. the way a load shifts on a long carry when you finally set it down. I don't have a word for what it was. I've been looking for one ever since I was 8 years old, sitting beside a spring in the Selkirk timber, watching something large and dark and deliberate walk back into the shadow of the canopy. I am not going to pretend I have found the word now. What I can tell you is what it did, and how it moved, and the specific character of the care it extended to a lost child with no claim on its attention. I can tell you that my mother understood it on a level she never articulated, but acted on every morning for 31 years. I can tell you that in 33 years of working the same country as a professional timber faller, I accumulated evidence that something large and patient and capable was moving through those north-facing drainages above the South Fork, and that it moved with a kind of purposeful discretion that I could not account for as any animal I had professional knowledge of. I can tell you that the deputy's report used the word sheltered and then put a question mark beside it, and that the question mark sat in that file for 20 years before my brother thought to go find it. Dale is gone now. He died in 2009 in Spokane of a heart condition he'd had for years and managed quietly in the way he managed everything. I drove over for the service and afterwards sat in his daughter's kitchen, drinking coffee and not saying much, the way you do. Before I left, his daughter handed me a manila envelope with my name on it in Dale's handwriting. Inside was the photocopy of the deputy's report, the one he had sent me in 1983, and a handwritten note that said, "I always thought Mom knew something we didn't. I think you know what she knew. It's yours to do what you want with." I put the envelope in the tin box with my mother's frost records and my field notebook. I am telling you now because Dale asked me to, in the way the note asked me to, and because Edna told me to keep the bowl and I kept it. And what she meant by keeping the bowl was not just the mush and the stump, but the whole account, the complete truth of it, kept safe until the right time. I think this is the right time. I think 71 years old with the property around me and Cass at my feet and the full weight of what I know pressing on the inside of my chest is the right time. The morning I set the last bowl down and did not go back for it. I came inside and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table where my mother used to sit with her hands flat on the wood. Cass lay at my feet. Outside the window the timber was fully lit now, the tamarack and fir going gold in the early light. I sat there for a long time. Then I got out a piece of paper and I wrote down, in as plain and precise a language as I could find, the account I have just given you. Not for publication, not for the county file, for myself and for whoever came after me who might need to hear that the country up there is old and it is watching, and that what it watches over sometimes is you. There is something in those Selkirk drainages that is larger than our categories for it, and it knows the difference between a child who needs help and everything else. I cannot explain that. I stopped needing to explain it a long time ago. I only needed to say it out loud before I was done. I put the bowl inside, on the kitchen shelf where my mother kept her postal scale. I've left it there since. If something in this account sits with you the way it has sat with me, the next story is there when you're ready.